Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
What's going on, Tristan? I see a much different background than your apartment in Hong Kong.
Yeah, well, it is just as warm here in Abu Dhabi, though definitely a drier heat than the humidity of Hong Kong. But I'm here in Abu Dhabi for the Hilly Forum, which is in many ways, I think, the UAE's answer to the Doha Forum. It's been the past 2 days, it's been excellent, really impressive group of people that they brought together. I'm here as well as my colleague at the Oxbridge Diplomatic Academy, Baroness Catherine Ashton, was also invited. And just fantastic to be back in the UAE.
Yeah, sounds like an interesting meeting, and as we'll get into, a very interesting time to be having these discussions. There's some activities going on next door across the waterways. But things have cranked up here on the hilltop. Classes have started again, and that's keeping me busy. And as I'm sure everyone is waiting to find out, the McFarland Mudhens are now 1-1 on the season. We won our season opener and then lost our second game, but we got another one tonight, so we'll keep at it. But yes, anyways, what's on the docket for today?
Well, we have quite a lot to get through today as the world seems to be moving unusually fast. And I know we say that pretty much every week, and yet the acceleration continues. We'll begin with a short update, particularly because it is an unfolding situation on the ongoing fallout from Israel's unprecedented strike on Hamas leaders in Doha, just across the Gulf from where I am now. Then discuss the trial of former Brazilian President Bolsonaro, and then China's major summit, which it hosted last week. So let's dig into it and begin with the dramatic development in the Gulf on September 9th, just yesterday afternoon, as we're recording this on the 10th. Israel carried out a precision strike in Doha, targeting Hamas's political leadership, who were reportedly assembled to consider a U.S.-backed ceasefire proposal, the same one that Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Saar, accepted on Monday. Now, for the first time, Israel extended its military campaign onto Qatari soil, striking at the location that has hosted Hamas's political bureau, established in Doha more than a decade ago at Washington's request, in order to facilitate indirect communications. This really is an extraordinary move. Now, even despite the strike's symbolic weight, its immediate results, it seems, were limited. Reports right now from Doha indicate that 5 Hamas staff members were killed, yet no senior leaders have been confirmed dead. And this raises questions about whether Israel achieved its stated objective or whether the main outcome was diplomatic fallout. The attack immediately triggered a flurry of diplomatic fallout. Qatar condemned it as a flagrant violation of sovereignty and immediately called for the UN Security Council to convene. And Qatar has stressed that its role has always been to facilitate diplomacy, and now it finds itself targeted in this conflict. And of course, this episode is particularly awkward, if not worrisome, for the United States, which relies on Qatar for hosting a massive U.S. airbase, while also being the key diplomatic site for negotiations with Hamas in an effort to end this war in Gaza. And events are certainly reverberating across the region. Arab states have decried the attack as indeed a violation of sovereignty. Meanwhile, Israel insists that it was an act of self-defense. And perhaps the most significant consequence is that this may have decimated much of the hope for a ceasefire or political resolution to the war in Gaza. I mean, certainly, at least in my eyes, anytime soon. With Qatar's mediation role now undermined, the profoundly fragile diplomatic tracks around hostages and truce negotiations now look even more uncertain. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this. How should we interpret this strike? Is it simply Israel trying a one-off against Hamas, or does it signal a dangerous new phase, one in which Israel feels completely fine to launch an attack on targets on the soil of a U.S. ally?
Yeah, I think this is big news, obviously, as you went through and talked about, and it is a major new sort of escalation on the part of Israel. And I do think it speaks to the fact that Israel, in many ways, has grown bolder in what they've done over the past 2 years, 3 years, with the actions they've taken in Gaza and not worrying about the repercussions internationally, about attacking Iran and starting the 12-day war they had with Iran. But this is a new level, as you say, because they've attacked a group on the soil of an American ally, and not even like some raid or something. These are precision weapons, but things can still go wrong and they can hit the wrong place. There are bombs blowing up, so there can be collateral damage. So this is a bold move by the Israelis on this. And I don't think necessarily that it will be the last. If they see targets of opportunity, I think they will continue to take them. And we'll talk about the role the U.S. might play in stopping them from doing that, potentially. It's unclear who was killed yet. There are some reports that a Qatari officer was killed in this as well, not just the Hamas staff members. But either way, it's a bold move and doesn't bode well. But Israel has long maintained that Hamas leaders abroad are legitimate targets. I think that goes beyond just Hamas. They've shown that Iranian targets and things like that are fair game. But this is, like I mentioned, they're striking now in the country that has been trying to act as a mediator for years, in the country that is a major regional ally of the United States. You mentioned Al Udeid Air Base is there. I've visited Al Udeid Air Base. It's huge, and without which the United States would be able to do not nothing, but it would have to do much less in the region without Al Udeid Air Base. So, a key partner of the United States. And this is at a point where the Hamas leaders were trying to have discussions over the latest ceasefire options. And to the point earlier, was this the Israelis not necessarily aiming to take out the leadership, but just to throw a wrench in the negotiations? Obviously, ending things in Gaza doesn't necessarily line up politically with what Netanyahu is trying to do, ultimately keeping himself out of prison and staying in office so he can stay out of prison. So I think we'll have to see what comes out of this. We do know that the White House was extremely upset. The president doesn't like it when people don't do what he expects of them or wants them to do, and has issued some fairly strong statements against this action. He immediately, when we realized it was happening, sent Steve Witkoff to warn the Qataris, although he wasn't able to get there in time to do that. I don't know what that would have done anyways, if he would have let them know. But I think there's going to be some strong discussions between Netanyahu and the president or senior officials. President Trump has shown that he's willing to be strong towards Netanyahu. He did when he got him to maintain the original ceasefire with the Iranians. This demonstrates that Netanyahu then, after some time, will just kind of go ahead and do what he wants anyways. And the U.S. has been allowing Israel, for the most part, to do what they want over the past 3 years anyways. So who knows how much strong words are going to have a reaction at this point. So that's worth watching moving ahead. Very dangerous escalation of things, in my opinion.
Absolutely. There are lots of ways in which you can spoil or stall a diplomatic negotiation. Resolution is not in the interests of Netanyahu's political survival and freedom. And that's absolutely true. But a military strike on the sovereign soil of any country, let alone a U.S. ally, is quite the way to spoil a diplomatic process. the only off-ramp out of this war. It is a violation of not just Qatari sovereignty, but of the institution of diplomacy itself. And so it's early days, but I really think that this is something quite significant.
Yeah, and it's worth noting as well, before we drop this subject for the moment, that, obviously since October 7th, this isn't the first time that the Israelis have dropped bombs on folks outside of Gaza. They've attacked into Syria, Lebanon, obviously, Yemen, Iran. So, they've shown that they're willing to do that. This, will be noted, is just the first time that it has been in a country that is such a close ally of the United States, and it was on a group that was trying to negotiate diplomatically. So we'll be watching this closely and see what happens.
Moving on to our second story, we turn to Brazil, where former President Jair Bolsonaro has officially gone on trial, marking a historic moment for Latin America's largest democracy. The charges that Bolsonaro faces stem from the events of January 8th, 2023, when thousands of his supporters stormed the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and the Congress in Brasilia, the Brazilian capital. Prosecutors allege that Bolsonaro was not just a bystander, but rather an active participant in planning the riots, and that he knowingly sought to overturn the results of the 2022 election, which he lost to the now current president of Brazil, Lula. At the center of the prosecution's case is a draft presidential decree that would have annulled the election results and declared a state of emergency. Bolsonaro claims was merely an idea, was reportedly circulated among top military officials and legal advisors in the weeks before the riot. Combined with encrypted WhatsApp messages, public speeches casting doubt on electronic voting, and high-level meetings, the prosecutors argue that Bolsonaro was laying the groundwork for this coup. If convicted, Bolsonaro could face prison time and further bans from holding office, though he's, it should be noted, already been declared ineligible to run again until at least 2030 by Brazil's top electoral court. So, Kelly, how do we view this trial in terms of Brazil's democratic institutions? What do you think? Is this a sign of accountability? Or, are we looking at a politically risky move that really could backfire?
Well, I think that's the rub, as they say, right? I mean, we'll have to see how this plays out and the trial actually ends, but it is obviously a critical moment of accountability, and Brazil's sending a message that even a former president isn't above the law, and the attempts to subvert democratic processes won't be tolerated moving forward. And I wish it was so in my own country. But the institutions, at least for now, seem to be holding. But there is risk as well. Bolsonaro, like other former presidents around the globe, remains an extremely polarizing figure, but does have a vast amount of supporters still. And those supporters are framing this as a political persecution, as you can imagine, or a witch hunt, quote, orchestrated by Lula to sideline his chief rival. And the Brazilian right does remain energized. They're very vocal, and they're increasingly becoming radicalized online, in large part because Bolsonaro is on trial. If the trial and its outcome is seen as politically motivated or even just poorly handled, it could reignite street protests, make this polarization worse, or even potentially spark some sort of unrest. I will note as well, on this point of the trial being poorly handled, The Economist had a huge cover story on Bolsonaro 2 issues ago, and they talked a lot about the Supreme Court in Brazil and the fact that it's doing a pretty good job, but it definitely needs to be reined in because it has a lot more power in Brazil than some Supreme Courts, and it's gotten too large and unwieldy. And it's much easier to bring a case before the Supreme Court in Brazil than it is in places like the United States. So they've gotten to the point where there's like 140-some thousand cases they handle a year. And it's gotten to the point where sometimes just individual judges are handing down rulings on certain things instead of like in the U.S. where all 9 judges have to rule on it and do all that kind of stuff. That's not a good situation, especially when you have such an important high visibility case such as this. You don't want just one judge making the decision on this. So anyways, that's another issue that this speaks to as a broader sort of long-term domestic problem in Brazil with the Supreme Court. But it's also not just a domestic issue, right? The U.S. angle here is becoming more prominent. President Trump is publicly defending Bolsonaro, echoing claims of unfair treatment and linking his legal troubles with Bolsonaro's. But more concretely, for Brazilians, the Biden administration has kept in place the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs that the president imposed that many in Brazil view as a retaliation for Lula's return to power and then the trials against Bolsonaro. So in a way, this trial of Bolsonaro is operating on 2 levels. Legally, it's about very specific crimes related to inciting violence and conspiring to overturn an election. But politically, it's also about who controls the narrative of Brazil's democracy. And this is something we see in many different places, like who is in control of that narrative and whether or not institutions can withstand the pressure from the other side's narrative. And what happens in the court is going to matter, obviously, as well. And we'll keep you folks updated on that once we get a verdict here. But the question is, if Bolsonaro is convicted, what happens to the movement he has led after that? If he's not convicted, what does that mean? And either way, it's not just about Bolsonaro. This is going to be a big moment of political accountability in Brazil as we look to see how Brazil moves forward as a democracy. So we will let you guys know what happens once we get a ruling.
Absolutely. This is a test, one of many that we are seeing, particularly in Western democracies at the moment, wherein the institutions and the liberal institutions are being fundamentally tested to see if they have resilience in the face of increasingly polarized politics.
All right, moving to our final story, and our resident summit man, Tristan Naylor, is going to handle this one. But we're going to move to the recent large summit that took place in Beijing. Nothing like dictators rolling out a bunch of military hardware. And this will roll into the interview that I did for our mini deep dive today on India. President Xi Jinping hosted a major international summit earlier this month. Officially, it was to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II. And the event was marked by one of the largest military parades in recent Chinese history. These things, as they tend to be, it was a tightly choreographed ceremony at the Great Hall of the People, and a lineup of a who's who of foreign guests that tells us a lot about the kind of world that China acts in and the types of folks that it cozies up to. Vladimir Putin was front and center. The always lovable Kim Jong-un was there as well, and he appeared in person for the first time since the pandemic. But then also President Modi from India. And that was a big deal because there's been tensions between India and China historically, but also more recently. But it wasn't just a commemoration, and Tristan will get into this, I'm sure, but it was also a statement. She used the memory of wartime victory to frame China's current leadership role in global affairs as part of this long, unbroken arc of anti-imperialist resistance. And in this context, Taiwan, always important when we talk about China, is cast not so much as a contested democracy, but as sort of this final piece of an unfinished historical story that she and the Chinese are telling. And the summit also functioned as sort of a diplomatic counterweight to the Western-led order. By gathering these folks here, China's sending a message that it can convene sort of its own grouping of powers, and it can do so just not through economic influence, but through this careful manipulation of history and historical memory and these sort of fictitious grievances that they run through these historical stories. So, Tristan, How should we interpret this summit in general, but also in terms of China's global ambitions? So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, something that I've said a number of times, at least on this podcast, and certainly have written about ad nauseum in my own work, is that it's really important when we look at summits, when we study them, when we analyze them, to think of them as fundamentally performative phenomena. And this was exactly as you alluded. This was a performative declaration. It's a performance of power, of course. It's a military parade, but it's also a performance of legitimacy and a performance of, which you also allude to, of order. Certainly both inwardly and outwardly and sort of domestically, she wants to tie his leadership and his position in the Communist Party, tying it to the party's wartime legacy and framing his consolidation of power as part of a very long tradition of defending sovereignty, which helps justify tighter political controls at home and particularly ongoing crackdowns on dissent. Now, in terms of the international or the outward dimension, this is about historical narratives around predominantly warfare, and China is betting that its framing of being not just but the leading anti-colonial power, the rightful heir to post-war stability, and a bulwark against Western hypocrisy, will resonate, especially within countries of the global South. This is a message that potentially has real appeal in regions including the African continent and Southeast Asia more broadly, where many countries harbor degrees of resentment over and towards Western interventions and certainly what many see as exploitative economic relationships. And most significantly and immediately, this has some very real and serious implications for Taiwan. She's emphasis on historical closure of this long story that you allude to suggests that he views Taiwan not as a long-term frozen conflict, but one that is needing to be resolved and potentially within his political lifetime as the sort of the ultimate achievement of his, unifying, in his view, China. Now, that raises, of course, the risk of escalation in the Taiwan Strait, especially if Xi comes to believe that U.S. deterrence is weakening or that international recognition of Taiwanese autonomy is creeping forward, something that we've also spoken about previously in this podcast. And then, at the same time, we've got the presence of these other leaders. The presence of Kim and of Putin really underscores the extent to which China is willing to not just work with rogue or revisionist states, but communicate performatively their allyship. And it helps reinforce Beijing's global counter narrative. And, this is not about creating a formal alliance structure like NATO, but it is about building. I said this is a performance of order, and this is about performing and building an order that is contrary to the Western one. So it is, I think, often quite easy to look at summits and military parades as just being ceremonial things that we can disregard. But I mean, it's certainly not how I've ever looked at these things, and I don't think it's how any of us should. These are part of much deeper political strategies. And in this case, particularly in terms of historical and political narratives, I think we're agreed that you can never disentangle the two. It rewrites the terms of the post-Second World War international order and very much seeks to place Beijing, and not Washington, as its moral and strategic center. And so for anyone following global diplomacy and global order, I think this is a profoundly striking moment.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, nobody spends all the time and millions of dollars just to throw a parade, right? There's deeper meanings behind that, and they're sending a message not just to the folks in China, but folks around the world, to the U.S. and Europe and our allies in Japan and South Korea and Australia, but also to, like you said, the folks in the global south and those that have felt under the boot over decades or centuries from the West through the legacy of colonialism, and even those that are trying to gain more traction within the system that we've had for the past 80 years. And what really interests me, being a historian and somebody that teaches about this stuff, is like the rewriting of the narrative, right? Of this historical narrative. And I think that's what's so key to a lot of this, is getting what is that story they're trying to tell? Why is it that particular story? What does it mean in terms of what they're trying to accomplish? And how are they going about doing that? What's the audience for that and all that kind of stuff? China has been doing this for a while. Russia, China, and North Korea all have their unique versions of World War II. I actually use a book in my class on this that's all about Russia, China, and North Korea and the myths they talk about and the narratives they push. And it covers World War II quite a bit and how they're using that as a tool to progress what they want to happen in today and in the future. So fascinating stuff. And I think another key point, though, too, is just to keep in mind, folks, that Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, they may be there, but like you noted, this isn't like a NATO-like alliance, right? I think that's important to keep in mind. They still have very large differences in many respects. They also still don't really trust one another. So while they have grown closer over the past half decade, in large part because of the war in Ukraine, I think it still is worth noting that this isn't like a new authoritarian NATO that's popping up or something like that. Anyways, all right, moving on. That ends our news roundup today. And we're now going to go to my conversation on the India-U.S. relationship and what Modi has been up to with his trip to China with Sameer Lalwani. Sameer is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program, and he is also a senior advisor with the Special Competitive Studies Project, a non-resident senior fellow with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and a research affiliate with the MIT Security Studies program. Sameer's research interests include deterrence, conventional military competition, technology alliances, and Indo-Pacific security. He is also a contributing editor to War on the Rocks. Let's listen in to the conversation. Hey folks, welcome back to this episode of Headlines in History, and I'm excited to be once again joined by Sameer Lalwani to talk about what the heck is going on with the U.S. and India since we last spoke. And I know that Tristan and I talked about this in relation to the U.S. putting on major tariffs on India, but Sameer is here today to kind of talk about the broader picture of what's going on and provide some updates. So Sameer, looking forward to what you got to say. Welcome, man.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
And so just to give our listeners a little bit of a refresher, can you kind of tell us what has been the sort of state of U.S.-Indian relations over like the last decade, we'll say, and how has that moved forward to some extent?
Yeah, well, I think the U.S.-India strategic relationship has progressed from administration to administration with bipartisan support, frankly, like 2.5 decades since 2000. And, a decade ago, you had some significant moves with India being named a major defense partner in the National Defense Authorization Act in 2016. The Trump administration really took it to new heights, did a lot of foundational agreements, really came to India as a support in a pretty intense military standoff with China in 2020. And that really fostered sort of even another level of strategic partnership. In the Biden administration, you saw this sort of go into the areas of strategic technologies and emerging technologies, robotics, space, AI. And I think it was on an upward trajectory into this administration. In February, there was a big Trump-Modi meeting at the White House, a major joint statement, a lot of stuff packed in there with like actual substance. And since then, things sort of started to take a nosedive. We can talk more about sort of some of the ways in which that happens.
So what was the impetus? Like, what's the drive on the U.S. side and the Indian side, or at least what was that impetus and drive trying to bump up that relationship?
There's headlines that are about shared values, about bipolarity and multipolarity, but really the subtext and the body copy is all about China, right? And that is sort of the strategic drive, the tectonic shift that is China is antagonist to a lot of friends of the United States in the region, including India, and it got pretty intense and personal in 2020 after a series of skirmishes over the course of a decade. And so that, I think, was intensifying the relationship and a sort of a serious mill-to-mill relationship. I mean, as we were speaking, there's a major army exercise going on in Alaska with the Indian Army and U.S. Army, 2-week exercise, pretty large scale. So that was, I think, China, sort of simply put, is the driver for all the reasons that I'm sure others have articulated. So its behavior, its rising power, its coerciveness, et cetera.
So things have not gone well between India and the U.S., to put it bluntly, over the past few months. There's been a couple things that have happened to kind of move that backward, I guess, to be more accurate. And they center around the tariffs that the U.S. imposed. And maybe you can give us a little bit of a explainer also on sort of like the India-Russia relationship. But then also there was a short-term fight between India and Pakistan that also kind of got the Indians upset at the United States. So what was going on there in both of those instances?
Yeah, so let's take them piece by piece. So, I mean, the tariffs was something that the Trump administration was big on in the first round, 2017 and 2020. There was efforts to pressure India to open up its markets. India does have some of the highest tariffs and trade barriers in the world. And that is sort of a history of protectionism in India that I think India came to the White House in February 2025 with the expectation they were going to make significant changes. And India sees this as an opportunity to also induce internal reforms. They know they need to reduce protections and allow players to compete for their own domestic champions to compete on the international market or allow for comparative advantage to take over. So I think they're willing to play ball with that. I think the trouble was they probably thought they were negotiating with Trump 1.0. As heard Indian analysts say, like that this is a different administration with a different level of confidence and wins that sort of it was amassing. And so probably India didn't put enough concessions and sweeteners on the table, concessions about how much of they're going to open up in the agriculture sector, for example, which is fairly sensitive and politically for India. But also the countries like South Korea and Japan are lining up with $350 billion to $500 billion in promised investments or promised purchases of American energy, weapons, data centers, things like that. And India didn't really line that step up. I think they could have. I think there were definitely suggestions that India should be sort of lining up some of their captains of industry to do a similar effort. So I think that was one of the fault lines. But trade's negotiable. I do think the thing that kind of threw India for a loop was sort of the 87-hour war with Pakistan, which we talked about a few months ago in May. And then the president coming out and claiming that he had resolved it and sort of brought peace to India and Pakistan. And Pakistan playing a very clever diplomatic move of offering to nominate the president for a Nobel Prize. The president sort of cares deeply about this. He has said he solved 7 wars so far, and he keeps on bringing up India and Pakistan as one of them. And I think the Indians for this is like very, very difficult for them to countenance because they have prided themselves on independence and their ability to solve their own problems, particularly a country like Pakistan. It's one thing for India to acknowledge that it brought it needed U.S. help when dealing with China. Even there, they're very sort of squeamish about acknowledging that in public. With Pakistan, that's sort of a no-go. Again, politically, it's devastating to go to the polls and say, we're tough and we can defeat our adversaries, but we need the United States to help us. So politically, it was a non-starter for the Modi government to acknowledge that. But politically, the president had already said he had done this and wanted credit for it and was getting credit for it from one side. So we're at an impasse. I think the president is pretty upset. It's been reported in the New York Times. And so then we sort of get this third layer of the added element is that I think Modi and Trump stopped talking to each other after a while. They have a bad call in June, and then Modi stops taking the president's calls, in part because he's afraid that the president would move the goalposts in the course of a leader-to-leader conversation. I mean, as an aside, I think the president sees himself as a little bit like Billy Beane in Moneyball. He loves to get on the phone and sort of work deals and close them, and he's probably good at that. And so I think the Indian government, like the Chinese government, doesn't want to just sort of put the leader on the phone without a plan. So the third layer comes in, which is Lindsey Graham has had a bill in Congress for a long time promising 500% tariffs on any country secondary sanctions on any country that's buying Russian oil, Russian weapons. India is high on that list. It's not the only country on that list. China is also the highest on that list. Europe is not far behind. I think they purchased about $40 billion in energy last year and from Russia. So India gets singled out by the president as sort of this extra layer of tariffs. So they have a 25% tariff 10 plus another 25%. So 50% tariffs, one of the highest in the world for the United States. And that part, the statement came out with saying 2 days ago that is still sort of one of the most important partners in the 21st century, take this relationship to new heights. So there's a contradiction, right? That I think is fundamentally stressing the relationship.
Yeah, we'll get into that contradiction at the end here. But didn't Trump also like the same time, around the same time as the India-Pakistan fight, was like hosting a major general from the Pakistani side or something too? That probably didn't make Modi feel warm and cozy towards the president either.
That's right. I mean, the Pakistanis played, I think, a masterful job of taking a little bit of daylight or a little bit of leverage, and then really opening the door. The army chief of staff, who is technically the most powerful person in Pakistan, got a sit down lunch with the president in the Oval Office or in the White House. So yeah, that definitely rankled the Indians. But more importantly, it was, I think, the president's. India can live with the White House's relationship with Pakistan. Frankly, Pakistan will probably scuttle it over time. But the thing they had a hard time with was when the president was turning around saying Pakistan's willing to acknowledge my role in bringing peace to you both. Why can't you? And I think there was not either. Indians were unable to persuade the president that this is politically suicide, or they didn't make the significant enough of an effort through the channels around the president, through the cabinet, et cetera. So it's still kind of unclear as to why they couldn't sort of communicate. I mean, there's a couple possible reasons. We don't have an ambassador to India right now. We don't have an assistant secretary for South Central Asia at the State Department. And so those are critical nodes of communication that would have been able to help or at least mitigate some of that misunderstanding and try to get out in front of this. But those mechanisms were not in place.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the assistant secretary for South and Central Asia, because he's the person that just did that job last is now here at ISD. Moving it forward up to today, the little rift in the relationship seems to maybe getting bigger because of recent events just in the past few days. So talk about Modi's trip to China, because as you said, they fought in 2020. I mean, this was a skirmish in 2020 that obviously has huge risks involved when you're talking about two major countries like India and China. And Modi was there and he was holding hands with Putin. Why did Modi take that step? And what do you think it says about how the Indians now view the U.S. relationship moving forward?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons why Modi went to this summit that looks like the Crinks Plus, right? Like it's got China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then India is kind of like this strange democratic outlier that shows up for this grouping. But, India has long professed before the Modi government throughout its history that it is either non-aligned and to today's parlance, multi-aligned. It believes in a multipolar world order. It believes that that is the most stable world order, but also that it affords India the most opportunity for its own strategic and development objectives in the world. So the SCO is an alternative grouping to the G7, G8, and to other, NATO, APEC, et cetera. And so India wants to be a partner in all those things. It's part of the BRICS as well. It's one of the sort of early founders of the BRICS. So that's consistent with its general approach. Now, obviously, the optics look terrible. And I think, though, that this time the Prime Minister Modi probably leaned into those optics. And the purpose was principally to send a message to the United States, maybe, that they have other options. Now, in truth, I don't think those options are that serious. I think this is sort of a skin-deep optical engagement. But, I think he was trying to send that message that he can pivot in a different direction. But I also think, besides multipolarity, India believes it wants to have influence in the global South. The global South seizes alternatives to the Western-led G7 order. And then finally, there's another part of this, which is that China's been very effectively coercing India, both politically, militarily, economically. And so in some ways, like India is under the gun. It's trying to get access to critical minerals and magnets for its auto industry, fertilizers, all these things China's withholding. So ironically, even though the SCO statement says something about affirming that states shouldn't coerce each other through economic means, part of the reason India's there is because it's being coerced through economic means by China.
Yeah, that's standard operating procedure for Beijing. So let's turn this a little bit from the American side. And I've been having conversations with friends and colleagues about this over the past few weeks. And Tristan and I talked about it on the podcast a couple episodes ago. But you briefly sort of touched on it already. But from the U.S. perspective, on one hand, the administration, Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, but especially Trump 2.0, sees China as the major threat moving forward. And there's the China hawks in the administration and the MAGA crowd on the outside are pushing all in on the China challenge and being ready to do that. So that's where they're sitting on one hand, which would speak to this building of a relationship with India that, as we have seen through different administrations over the past decade. But then on the other hand, you've got these same folks that are saying that we shouldn't be focusing on Ukraine and Russia. That's not really our issue. We've got to focus on China. But then Trump lays down these tariffs because of, or in large part because of, the oil that India is getting from Russia and allowing them to shirk sanctions and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, we've been trying to rack our brain around, like, what's going on here? Why are they doing this and potentially creating a large rift in a country that we really need if we're going to challenge China moving forward?
Yeah, I think this comes down to two things. One, I do believe at its core, even if today it's not expressed in such terms, at some point we're going to get back to long-term strategic competition with China. I think that there's enough history to tell us that we are sort of fated to, at the very least, compete, probably intensely, and perhaps fight. And so I think we're going to get back to tighter export controls on NVIDIA chips, and we're going to get back to arming our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and tightening up those relationships. So I do believe that inevitably will come out, even though I think in the early part of this administration, there's an effort to, score wins on the board, so maybe even short-term wins that look to steeply favor the United States, even over our allies.
So the more of like a domestic posturing.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can speculate what the runway time is, but probably 18 months to 2 years. And then I think the administration probably has to switch back to a more middle of the road approach, at least in foreign policy and allies and partners. And maybe we're already seeing that switch back when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, right? Like from a very bold and disruptive approach to let's solve this and tilt almost towards the Russian side in order to solve this, to now kind of shifting back towards backing the European NATO position. But I do think like what's going on here is probably a little more personal, right? And that's sort of what we alluded to, is that I think the president is pretty upset, particularly with someone he considered his friend, with Prime Minister Modi, that he was, either contradicted and possibly lectured to. And that is fueling some of these other things. So I don't think either of these other two issues of trade openness and sort of tariff levels, trade barriers, or Russian oil purchases by India are really unsolvable problems. I mean, I think it's just a number when it comes to trade, and that number can sort of go up or down, but like Indians can sort of live with a certain level of tariffs like the rest of the world is, and then try to sort of work to change that over time. And on Russian oil, frankly, it sounded to me like the marginal benefit of Russian oil purchases, spot price, had had narrowed so much that India was ready to start buying American oil. I mean, I talked to some oil execs who were in India in July, and I think that India is on the path to getting there. If it hadn't been singled out as this sort of very personal issue, like change your foreign policy or else, which is what's coming from, I think, Peter Navarro in the White House. But if that hadn't been made that way, I think we would have gotten to a point where India was going to start reducing its Russian oil purchases and switching over to alternative, including American oil. So those are solvable problems. It's the India-Pakistan Nobel Prize. Did the president sort of solve this or not? Issue that I think is kind of personal. And that's where why did the diplomats get paid the big bucks? I mean, India's got to find a way to acknowledge the president's position on this and respect it and appreciate it, while also trying to stand their ground, not to say that they basically were muscled by an ally into making a concession. And there's ways to do that. I think there's probably ways you can sort of acknowledge something in time one and then make it action in time two. But I think that has yet to happen.
So that'd be something to kind of watch out for moving forward if we see something along those lines, to sort of maybe demonstrate that we're getting closer to a coming back together between the U.S. and India.
Yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of opportunities there. There's a lot of stuff happening on the defense side that creates opportunities for anyone to point to and say, look, this is a demonstration of the positive part of our relationship. Let's do more of that. They can highlight and accent that in certain ways. The president is supposed to theoretically go to India for a quadrilateral leaders summit, possibly in November. I think that could be an opportunity where a lot of deals could be done. A lot of things could be signed, trade, defense purchases, oil contracts, and there could be a total change in tone. But I do think, like the rest of the world is recognizing, there's a little bit more. The American discount is not going to be there. I mean, there's going to be sort of like a discount on sort of expectations of the United States after this, because we've just caused whiplash for the entire world, particularly our friends and allies.
All right. Well, we'll be looking out to see if that November summit happens or if Trump goes. We might see you again in late November, early December to give us a readout of what happened. But Sameer, it was good as always. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Great to chat. Thanks again.
Thanks again to Sameer for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdullah Nassif. Thanks to the Carnegie Corporation in New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GeoDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.